episode 5 of the Bugman's View of Fascism. Thank you for sticking with me this long. We're over 2/3 of the way towards the end, over 2/3 of the way done. We'll probably do this episode and then one more should wrap it up. We're starting from the first full paragraph on page 21, second paragraph overall, where it starts with, by the beginning. We're going to talk about the change in identifying some of these former communist countries that used to be people's darlings and they would make apologies for, and then after it collapsed, the perspective is going to change. By the beginning of the 1990s, it had become increasingly the case that researchers and journalists found more and more neo-fascist features among the institutions and political practices of those nations long imagined to represent the revolutionary left. More and more authors spoke of some sort of quote-unquote Stalino-fascism that the Marxist-Leninist nations of Eastern Europe had long harbored. It was discovered, for example, that the leftist communist government of Nicolae Ceausescu had actually always been a sort of fascism. The legitimating ideology of the regime had been a kind of neo-fascist, quote, syncretic mixture of decayed Marxist tenets, self-aggrandizing ethnocentric myths, and unabashed celebration of Ceausescu himself. Xenophobia, autarky, isolationism, anti-Occidentalism, and anti-intellectualism were the main motifs underlying this ideological construct, end quote. Now, on this issue, it's incidental, but Matt Johnson did an episode 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think, about the Romanian communist torture prisons that were made famous by this one guy. I can't remember his name, but several people have written about him and brought up his book that I've come across. Like Revelo P. Oliver was one who I think talked about it in must have been the 60s. But the book's called The Anti-Humans or The Unhumans or The Non-Humans. I can't remember the exact title, but it's about these awful communist torture prisons in Romania that, were basically carrying on this kind of like illuminist, soul-searching, soul investigation, and then this really bizarre like Freudianism. So what they would do is they would take these reactionaries, these people who oppose the communist regime, like religious types like priests or whatever, and then they would put them through really horrible sexual and I don't know how to say this in a nice way. They would put them through really disgusting, physically disgusting torture. And also all types of psychological abuse, trying to break their psyche and get them to associate the things that they loved and wanted to protect in this universe, the things that the communists were opposed to, with filth and degradation. And if you look at the way that our current Western society works, it's pretty much the same thing. Mass media will try to associate the things that you love and cherish, like religion, the family, and sexual life. Those things, for instance, which are all good, they'll try to associate them with, wretched, disgusting behavior in an attempt to get you to completely retreat from family and sexual life, which is something that ultimately will mean the destruction of you and your culture and probably your civilization. So, in my opinion, this kind of argument that they're making here about, oh my God, we just discovered that Ceausescu was fascist. Well, he wasn't fascist when Jimmy Carter went to go visit him, and his regime, or the regime that he came out of, the communist regime in Romania, over its history has carried through a long trajectory of implementing these same kind of things that we see in our society and from before. So, I don't know. I think it's ridiculous. there's probably some things that every regime has in common, and that's why you can say that anything has characteristics of fascism or whatever you want, because some things are just based on pragmatism and practicality, and you have to implement them no matter what. These were among the properties that had been used to identify neo-fascism for almost half a century. It was discovered that quote-unquote quasi-fascism, quote-unquote proto-fascism, and quote-unquote incipient fascism were to be discovered almost everywhere in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. And so what's going on? The Soviet Union is collapsing. There are a whole bunch of regimes in these different countries where I think typically right after the collapse, all of the communists are still in power. And those people are either representing elites that are friendly to Moscow, or they're genuinely local elites. So there's going to have to be regime change in all these countries coming out of Washington. We're going to have to get liberal democracies in power in all these countries. And so you certainly are going to have to now flip the propaganda, and you're going to go from saying that these were communists to actually they were fascists all along. And as we've already established in this series, these prior episodes in this series and other places, calling somebody fascist or National Socialist is saying that they're illegitimate politically. They're outlaws. They can be destroyed at whim. So you can see how that is going to feed into the episodes in Yugoslavia that we're going to talk about here in just a second. Okay, quasi, proto, and incipient fascisms were to be discovered almost everywhere in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. It would seem that latent fascism had been everywhere for decades, particularly in the Soviet Union. And what do you know, they just discovered it right out of the blue. In Yugoslavia, egregious acts of ethnic cleansing, quote unquote, which many saw as fascist, were undertaken by some of the socialist leadership. So I'm pretty sure he's talking about the Serbs and Slobodan right there. So the idea is that even though these guys are formerly socialist and communist, we're gonna start calling them fascist because they were doing ethnic cleansing, and it's fascist just by definition because it's nationalist, right? In the early 1990s, it was very clear, and we did a series, or I uploaded a bunch of videos from Slobodan Milosevic's trial, and then I did one particular in-depth examination into I can't remember what her name was. It was Jamie something. I want to say it was like Jamie Lasker Horowitz or something like that. But when you looked into the lady, she was the one who was heading up one of those NGOs investigating Slobodan Milosevic's crimes, and she was tied into the deep state, and her assistant, who was actually writing all the reports about what was going on in Yugoslavia, she didn't know anything about Yugoslavia. Her entire academic background, she had like a master's degree or something from some good schools. She had some education, but she wasn't an expert. Her entire educational background was about Jews in Russia. Okay, it was the history of Jews in Eastern Europe. But she was brought in by the NGOs to write reports on Yugoslavia and these so-called crimes, these crimes that were alleged to have occurred and for which he wasn't convicted of them because he died in jail, right? Just like somebody in the news right now. But anyway, I'm getting too far off topic. The point is that these aspersions, which are cast on people who are pursuing goals contrary to the Washington regime, there's a long history of labeling these people with this stuff. He's talking about it from the academic perspective. I'm just pointing out that on my channel we got some material talking about the practical side of politics as well that goes with what he's saying here. By the early 1990s, it was very clear that the study of neo-fascism had become increasingly uncertain concerning its subject matter. The Marxist interpretation, which had provided the substance of a great deal of the neo-fascist accounts for decades, had been largely abandoned by the Marxist theoreticians in the Soviet Union and Communist China. Over the course of time, some of the specialists in Marxist-Leninist Eastern Europe had not only rejected the traditional Marxist-Leninist interpretation of fascism and Neofascism, but they argued that Italian fascism had been the only, quote-unquote, progressive solution to the social and economic crisis that had beset Italy after the First World War. So what they're saying is that some of these experts, some of the specialists in Marxism, Leninism, and communism in Eastern Europe came around to the idea that fascism was the only progressive, i.e. good, right? These are the kind of people, if they're in any way the kind of people I think they are, the word progressive means good. But you can't just say good, so you're going to say progressive. The only good solution to the social and economic crisis that had beset Italy after the First World War. It was no longer obvious that fascism with a big F and little f, big fascism, little fascism, or neo-fascism were unequivocally of the retrograde, anti-modern, quote-unquote, right. And so once you start to talk about fascism as being a good thing or a useful thing, it can no longer, by definition, be of the right because the right is bad, right? So it has to stop being rightist doctrine as soon as you've attached good qualities or usefulness to it, utility. By the early 1990s, it was clear to specialists that the distinction between fascism, National Socialism, and the varieties of Marxism-Leninism was not at all obvious. This is also the distinction between National Socialism and National Bolshevism, for instance. You know, I mean, once you start looking into this stuff like fascism, National Socialism, National Bolshevism, it's pretty clear they're on a gradient, or there's a few traits, or there's emphasis in one area. Fascism, as we've talked about here in the comments and other places, fascism is emphasizing the civic idea, whereas National Socialism is emphasizing the racial idea. But at the end of the day, they function pretty similar. And the varieties of Marxism-Leninism, so National Bolshevism, for instance, I mean, you know, National Bolshevism has the civic idea too. So the difference between it and fascism are not immediately apparent to me. Taken out of historical time, taken out of their particular context and looking at the ideas as such. By that time, scholars simply acknowledged that observable reality had, quote, undermined the established concepts of right and left in politics, end quote. And of course, you know, we get this today. We've got lots of people saying this even now here in my channel, you know, that the left-right concept is just no longer useful. And so, you know, what he's saying is that same observation was being made in academia in the early 1990s with regard to these problems, distinguishing between these ideologies. The scholars were saying the same thing that some of you guys have said here in the comments. It's just like, look, this left-right stuff is just a complete mess. Let's just move past it. And then you got, on the other hand, you have people like Franz Dancy who are saying, well, look, I'll explain it to you in a helpful and useful way, and you should just talk about it like this. And so those are two different options, for instance. It seemed evident that rather than a linear relationship between the left and right, the anti-democratic right and left were actually related in curvilinear fashion, with, quote, the extremes on the right and left, end quote, meeting to produce the evident similarities shared by fascism and Marxism-Leninism. Notable specialists made the point. There were fundamental affinities between the various forms of Marxism-Leninist rule, Marxist-Leninist rule, and the varieties of fascism. So I don't know if this is getting into the horseshoe theory stuff. I think it kind of might, but I haven't really thought about it enough. The situation had become very awkward for academics who sought to standardize the study of neo-fascism. It was uncertain what they were trying to study. So imagine that, you know, you're working with a certain definition of fascism, and you're going out there, you know, trying to categorize these different countries, political parties, movements, groups, etc. And then at the same time, the very definition that you were using is no longer in vogue. So you're in a tight spot. It was uncertain what they were to study. By the last years of the past century, it had become evident that the meaning of what neo-fascism was taken to be would have to be recast. By the mid-1990s, so things started to change really, I guess, around 1990. And so now we're talking about the mid-90s, so 5 or 6 years later. Some Marxist scholars sought to retrench after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the economic transformation of post-Maoist China. Stalinism and Maoism, we were told, were not and had never really been Marxist regimes. You'll recognize this, friends, as not true communism, not true socialism. Come on, right? Stalinism and Maoism, we were told, were not and had never really been Marxist regimes. Many who sought to salvage Marxism fell back to pre-Stalinist or non-Stalinist authors: Antonio Gramsci, Angelo Tosca, and Leon Trotsky. And I don't know, kind of to me, I mean, Trotsky the Trotskyites had pretty much taken over, I think, in Western communism, at least in America, by the 1960s. The Stalinists were all had gone abroad, laid low, jail, something or other. You know, they weren't really in vogue anymore at all. And then the Gramsciites, those are all of the cultural Marxists. Those are the people advocating the long march through the institutions. So many who sought to salvage Marxism fell back to pre-Stalinist. I don't know. I would disagree with this, and I would say this is where we bring in our specialty from the conspiracy theory literature and from everything that we know about politics that A. James Gregor is probably not into. We've got other explanations, including the ethnic explanation for why Leon Trotsky was more important, and then we know that there was a conscious shift in policy from a group of Jewish academics in the Frankfurt Circle. Isn't it Frankfurt School? Yeah. So the Frankfurt School, and they're doing what Gramsci said. So I would say that's different stuff. But at any rate, it was really bearing fruit in the 90s. It was Trotsky, after all, who had pointed out the quote-unquote fateful similarities shared by Stalinism and fascism. But the thing here about that claim by Trotsky is that it's just part of the basic Western propaganda structure. Everybody you don't like's a fascist. And so since he didn't like Stalin and Stalinism, they became fascist. So even if Trotsky was right that there were similarities between those two regime types, he wasn't really concerned with that. That's not really what bothered him. What bothered him was the fact that he wasn't in charge. However, many leftists might have considered the Soviet Union to have been the Marxist, quote-unquote, vanguard of communism. However many leftists might have considered the Soviet Union to have been the Marxist, quote-unquote, vanguard of communism, it was perfectly clear that such had never been the case. Marx's epigonies were constrained to begin at the beginning. By the end of the 1990s, the wiser among them attempted a reformation. Very little attention was devoted to the histories of flawed Marxist regimes. The theoretical retrenchment proceeded as though the statism, now he's really getting them here, he's really bearing down on these guys hard. The theoretical retrenchment proceeded as though the statism, the quote-unquote cult of personality, the hegemonic single party, the ideological conformity, the concentration camps, the mass murders, the economic exploitation, and the countless economic failures that filled the history of Marxist-Leninist China or the Soviet Union were completely irrelevant to the contemporary search for neo-fascism. So, I'm trying to think of a good example. If you're arguing with a leftist or a Marxist, they tend to exist in this realm of pure reason. And what I mean is that practical issues, the real world experience, these things don't really penetrate their mind view and their world set. They've already made up their mind. They've already joined Marxism as a religion or a quasi-religion at minimum. And none of this stuff bothers them. So even though we've got this huge list here, statism, cult of personality, mass murders, concentration camp, economic exploitation, and countless economic failures, they can't lose track of they can't lose faith in the idea that Marxism will bring about a materialist utopia. Even though after the Bolsheviks took over the Soviet Union, they spent something like 7 or 8 years where they had tractor factories but couldn't build any tractors. And the only tractors that they ended up building were only functional as stationary engines. Okay, they were generators basically with wheels that you could use to move them around. So that's an economic failure coming from a government that says we prize technological ascendancy. The basic fundamental issues are things like the Marxists believe that everybody, or they did believe, like I'm talking about the historical record here. They said that we've got to eliminate differences in wealth and income, so we're going to flatten out the income distribution, but at the same time, we value technology. If you know anything about technology, you know that innovations and and scientific progress comes about from a very small number of people who are high IQ, well-educated, and in the right kind of environment to produce that stuff. And those people typically are going to have money, right? Most of these inventors and scientists are going to have a lot of capital built up around them in which they can work, and they're going to be high IQ people, so they're going to come from families with money, generally. Well, they ran all those people out of the country or shot them. But at the same time, they couldn't figure out that this would lead to a complete inability to make materialist technological progress. So the West had to come in and give all this stuff to them, give them the money, give them the technology, which is actually what happened. But that is not going to sink in with these leftist Marxist people. So they're living in the realm of pure reason, where practical experience in the real world don't ever come to bust their little soap bubble that they're floating around in. But the problems here are that once these academics in the mid-90s had been exposed, and all of the crimes of Chinese communism and Soviet communism have really come out, they're now going to have to ignore most, which is what they do today. They're going to have to ignore most of the history of the 20th century. And I'm seeing more and more authors pushing the seemingly true notion that, seemingly true. It's definitely true that communism killed more people than National Socialism, but that was basically taboo, I think, to say that up until probably the 70s or 80s. And then now it's just becoming more and more common. So the Marxists are in a tight spot, and they're just going to lie their way out of it. Fascism was once again identified as the all but exclusive source of genocidal violence, irrationality, and reaction. And so we're just totally regressing backwards in time. Because these people's research agendas started to implode around them. So they fell back on the old standby, which is the World War II propaganda stuff, where you blame the Katyn Forest Massacre on the Germans. Fascism was once again identified as the all but exclusive source of genocidal violence, irrationality, and reaction. And I'd just also like to point out the fact that the arrows go in both directions here. So if fascism is, as these academics believe, the all but exclusive source of genocidal violence, irrationality, and reaction, and then you find genocide in Africa or something taking place among African tribes, then you just simply identify the source of that genocide as incipient fascism or fascist tendencies or, proto-fascist or whatever. That's how they operate. Some authors wrote as though the sad histories of mass murder in the Soviet Union, China, or Kampuchea had never taken place. If the 20th century was the history of war, mass murder, and irrationality, fascism was its sole source. It was fascism, committed to but two absolute principles, violence and war, that inspired the mayhem of the 20th century, of the entire century. Marxist-Leninist regimes seem to have had precious little to do with any of it. More than that, fascism itself was the inevitable byproduct of capitalism. We are told with absolute confidence that, quote, fascism is first and foremost an ideology generated by modern industrial capitalism, end quote. We are informed at the cusp of the 21st century that fascism comes to power through the connivance of the quote-unquote establishment and proceeds to increase the profits of capitalism through the, quote, exploitation of ordinary workers, end quote. The existence of quote-unquote private property under the conditions of monopoly capitalism generates, quote, alienation and exploitation, end quote. Fascist rule exacerbates that alienation and exploitation and produces the quote-unquote social contradictions that only violence or revolution can resolve. We find ourselves once again in the infancy of fascist studies. So what he's saying here is that all of the progress has been lost and we have completely regressed in terms of scholarship to where we were in the 1930s. Because the experiential record, the historical record for Marxism is so bad after 80 years that they have had to deny reality and chalk all this stuff up to fascism, or else it would be laid at the doorstep of Marxism itself. It is not at all clear how such notions provide any insight into what Neofascism might be, or how any of this explains the elements of Neofascism clearly evident in the former quote-unquote socialist nations of Eastern Europe and Asia, where private property no longer existed by law. The fact that the numbers involved in the mass murders in the Soviet Union, China, and Kampuchea exceeded those under fascism is neither explained nor addressed at all. So that's what I was getting at. Is this? It's becoming more and more common, I think, to see people say this, even though for most of the 20th century you wouldn't talk like that. Even if you knew it and believed it, you wouldn't say that. The entire issue is dismissed as unworthy of discussion, and he's got a footnote here. And so we're going to read that footnote. This is the footnote about how it's unworthy of discussion. Quote, this is the footnote. I would suggest that Stalinist Russia, despite the gulags, was not fascist. The author mentions the, quote, Soviet extermination of the kulaks, end quote, only in passing, offering absolutely no explanation of mass murder in a society in which capitalism no longer existed. So you see Gregor's got him trapped there because the previous argument, the argument on the previous page was that mass murder and violence and all of these bad things only come from fascism. Fascism is only produced by industrial or late industrial capitalism. So therefore, you've got to have a transition from capitalism to fascism before you can get genocide. And if you're getting ethnic cleansing, genocide, and mass murder in Marxist societies, what happened to the theory? Either they're not Marxist, or the other the explanatory factors are not powerful. And so the Marxists they're just going to ignore it, or they're going to do the Trotskyist thing and claim that Stalinist Russia was not really Marxist at all. Whatever the disposition of post-communist Marxists, not to speak the question whatever the disposition of post-communist Marxists, not to speak to the question of violence, murder, and irrationality in Marxist regimes, the many difficulties that collect around the study of Neofascism cry out for some kind of resolution. If capitalism is the taproot of fascism, and it is only fascism that causes war and commits genocide and mass murder, how can one explain wars between socialist countries and the mass murder of incalculable numbers of innocents in Marxist systems? Pardon. In effect, it is very difficult to put together arguments that are very compelling concerning the relationship between capitalism and fascism that answer the question of how one might identify neo-fascist movements and regimes in the 21st century. If there's a relationship between the two, it is a very complex one, and it is counterintuitive to imagine that capitalists dominated Mussolini, still less Hitler, to produce the enormities we tend to identify with either or both. We can say that with some confidence, since non-capitalist systems like Stalinist Russia and Maoist China produced, we can say that with some confidence, since non-capitalist systems like Stalinist Russia and Maoist China produced enormities of greater magnitude. So, to the extent that capitalists had influence over Mussolini and Hitler, and that led to these genocides or mass murders, you can look at Stalin and Mao and show that industrialists, capitalists had no influence on them, and they committed even greater mass murders. So the explanatory factor here that the Marxist scholars were trying to use is just garbage. It's absolute garbage. Another thing I'd like to point out is this relationship between capitalism and fascism, as seen from the communist or Marxist perspective. You can imagine that there are three basic world political ideologies. There is liberal democracy, there's fascism, and there's communism. If you pick any one of those, they will claim that the other two are closely related and in collusion with each other. So Marxism, as we see here, says that capitalism and fascism are closely related and that they collude, they conspire with each other. If you take liberal democracy, then they say that fascism and Marxist communism are both totalitarian and that they share a lot of the same traits. If you are a fascist, they will say that liberal democracy and communism come from the same wellspring and that they're both part of an international conspiracy. So, it's up to you to kind of decide which one of those arguments is the most persuasive. I started, of course, with the Western liberal democratic interpretation and chalked up, fascism and communism both to the totalitarian ideologies. But now, after having researched and read about this topic for several years, it is my belief that it's much more likely that the fascist argument is true or the National Socialist argument is true, and it's really Western liberal democracy and Marxism that are the two twins. But interestingly enough, it was actually people like Anthony Sutton who convinced me of that, and not any kind of National Socialist or fascist. It was looking at all the close and conspiratorial relationships between the early stages of Marxism and Western high finance. But anyhow, we'll move on. But I wanted to point that out because it's just kind of ironic how you pick one of these three and they always say the other two are against them. Invariably, this is what they say. What emerges from all this is the realization that the 1990s were critical years for the study of neo-fascism. While the study of historic fascism has matured to the point which one might speak of an abiding consensus of opinion among specialists, the study of neo-fascism proceeded to unravel. Sorry, we'll do that one again. While the study of historic fascism had matured to the point at which one might speak of an abiding consensus of opinion among specialists, so he's saying the top men working on historical fascism, like Mussolini's fascism, and I think the three that we've talked about here are Renzo de Felice, Ernst Nolte, and Stanley Payne. And several people in the comments have said that they got a copy of Stanley Payne's book, Fascism, and that they read it, and that it was either agreeing with what we're reading here or that it was useful or good. So we've got that on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have the study of Neofascism proceeded to unravel. So this doesn't make any sense, right? The more that we understand the origins and life of the original fascism itself, that should actually help us to define and have great clarity over what neo-fascism is. But instead, it blew up, which shows that it's really just a propaganda effort anyway, and it's related to politics rather than historical study. Talking about like politics of I've got to say this person's good and that person's bad for remunerative gain or to advance in the university. Neo-Marxists attempted to reattach fascism to capitalism, industrial capitalism, or finance capitalism, according to their respective fancies, but the enterprise did not prosper. Nonetheless, almost everyone who's devoting time to the search for neo-fascism appeared comfortable with the identification of his or her subject matter with individuals, groupuscules, movements, and even governments that might somehow be characterized as quote-unquote reactionary and quote-unquote right-wing. Almost everyone who was devoting time to the search for neo-fascism was comfortable with the identification of his or her subject matter with all sorts of different entities, political actors, we'll say, who were right-wing or reactionary. So they're very free with, saying that any type of right-wing or reactionary party is neo-fascist. Very few chose to attempt comparative studies of historic Marxist, Leninist, and fascist regimes as a preamble to their primary undertaking. So this would be a good example. We'll take the Bolshevik Party in 1916 and 1917, let's say. We'll write up a short history of them that's about 2 pages long. Then we will strip out all of the names of individuals, organizations, and places so that we only have a general account of what they were doing. We'll then give it to one of these scholars and say, is this a neo-fascist organization? And they would say yes, right? They wouldn't be able to tell the difference between left, right, modern, and ancient. They wouldn't have any idea. They would totally screw it up because they're really trigger happy, and they're just wanting to pull the trigger on this word called neo-fascist. I got to take a short break. I'll be right back. Very few chose to attempt comparable studies of historic Marxist, Leninist, and fascist regimes as a preamble to their primary undertaking. No one chose to compare left-wing Marxist regimes with the so-called right-wing fascism of Mussolini in terms of their respective anti-democratic orientation, quote-unquote, charismatic leadership, single-party dominance, putative irrationality, and disposition to employ violence, countenance genocide, and seek political resolution through war. Because if we did an honest accounting, you know what we would find? That the results would either vindicate fascism or it would condemn Marxism. So we just can't look at it. The 1990s created very special problems for the study of neo-fascism. Most European scholars were content to deal with the issue with the commonplace distinctions with which they had grown comfortable. They had been students of professors who never hesitated to speak of fascism, big F, fascism, little f, and neo-fascism as reactionary, right-wing, and devoid of even the suggestion of serious political and social thought. They had learned well. For them, fascism would forever remain devoid of thought, reactionary, racist, and fratricidal. For over half a century, students had learned little else. So this is what happened in Europe after World War II. Anyone who had been friendly and an intellectual would have been, just like barred or certainly retired or with heavy disabilities. So the people who would have been able to speak for this political ideology were kicked out, and a bunch of, I don't know, what can we say? A bunch of liberal Democrats, communists, and all the various degenerates that society produces were instead given an amplified podium from which to speak to everybody. And they used it well. And so the next generation of scholars who had learned from the people who were basically appointed by the Allied commissions after the war, they don't know anything. They don't know anything because they were listening to ideologues rather than real scholars. By the 1990s, remarkably few chose to speak to the issue of how Marxism-Leninism, Maoism, or Pol Potism, which appeared to share so much with Neofascism, might figure in comparative reflections. Many authors chose to deal exclusively with those quote-unquote right-wing political expressions one found in Central and Eastern Europe, but only after 1989, essentially after the disappearance of Marxism-Leninism. Under those circumstances, one was not expected to deal with the problems of a quote-unquote left-wing fascism. Given all that, a great many persons appeared comfortable with the readiness with which references to the quote-unquote radical right dilated into a discussion about quote-unquote neo-fascism, as though both shared some intrinsic, if fugitive, meaning. And of course, communist parties were running in elections all throughout Europe for the second half of the 20th century. Fascism and National Socialism were banned, of course. So the double standard is just extreme and only gets worse over time, honestly, because starting in the 70s and 80s, people's free speech in Europe just is completely removed, and you can't even talk about the historical record anymore in Europe, because if you did that, you would underline the New World Order, the post-World Order, as we've talked about. So you can't do that. And these scholars are obliging by not comparing things that would break down that order. Before the century came to a close, quite independent of the neo-Marxist revival, the study of neo-fascism was destined to undergo yet further transformation. Initially, the new candidate interpretations gave their appearance of being more sophisticated and objective than most of their predecessors. We were told, for example, that the term, quote-unquote, extreme right failed to, quote, pick up the fact that fascism's intellectual pedigree has not been uniquely right-wing, end quote. So there's just a small ray of light piercing through the darkness there that could not be, quote, dismissed as necessarily irrational, end quote. Moreover, an attempt was made to distinguish the neo-fascism of the post-World War II period from conservative dictatorships and military authoritarianism. So, for example, we're going to say at this point, we're going to admit that Francisco Franco and Metaxas in Greece and Pinochet in Chile weren't necessarily fascist, okay? They were just military authoritarians or conservatives, as the case may be. At the same time, diminishing effort was employed to acknowledge the differences between fascism and National Socialism. So they're going to let the authoritarians and conservatives off the hook, but they are not going to try to salvage fascism itself. What had been a fairly standard distinction between Hitler's National Socialism and Mussolini's fascism by the early 1980s, so he's saying the scholars had distinguished between these two, and I guess most other people had as well. What had become a fairly standard distinction between Hitler's National Socialism and Mussolini's fascism by the early 1980s, yeah, so that's the scholars by the early 80s had formed the distinction between these two things, was no longer allowed. That National Socialism was fundamentally racist and distinct from the doctrinal nationalism of fascism was no longer accepted as credible. So this is what's really going to motivate people like A. James Gregor, who are interested in fascism and want to salvage its reputation, is he goes from, in the 1980s, being able to put forward what he sees as the historical truth about fascism, to falling back into this like 1940s, 1950s worldview in which now fascism and Hitler are the same thing again, and fascism's being blamed for all these mass murders. The National Socialism was fundamentally racist and distinct from the doctrinal nationalism of fascism, was no longer accepted as credible. Homicidal anti-Semitism no longer ideologically distinguished Hitlerism from fascism. Anti-Semites and those who denied that the massacre of Jews took place under the ministrations of Hitler's forces were all uniformly spoken of as quote-unquote neo-fascist. And so I think most people know that Mussolini's regime, especially in the earlier period, was not particularly opposed to Jews. It may have had the effect of lowering Jews' preferentially selected high finance and high industrialist position in society. I don't really know anything about the history of the Jews in the 19th and 20th century Italy, so forgive me if I misspeak, but it seems like Italian fascism was not going after the Jews as such, because it also wasn't going after industrialists, capitalists, and bankers as such. But to the extent that fascist Italy succeeded, it would have deprivileged Jews simply by dealing with all the problems that it had outlined for itself. Whereas Hitler, on the other hand, and National Socialism were targeting Jews directly. So those are very different ideologies. But if you look at the way that fascism gets talked about, they'll point out that in 1942 or 43 or something, once the Germans took over Italy, as the fascist regime began to fall apart and experienced all kinds of fractures, the Germans were shooting partisans. They were shooting communist partisans, including Jews. So, oh my God, that means the fascists did the Holocaust. Or under German supervision, Jews were deported from Italy. Oh my God, that means the fascists did the Holocaust. So the arguments are not really very good. It's kind of like how people blame the United States and the United States government and citizens for not ending the Holocaust sooner. So it's this really bizarre and neurotic Jewish worldview in which if you as a non-Jewish person do not devote 100% of your energies to Jews who are in danger, then you are morally culpable for those Jews' death. And it's really just, it says a lot about Jewish psychology in general and the value that they put on Jewish lives as opposed to non-Jewish lives. So that's part of the explanation for where this stuff comes from here. Okay, irrespective of how carefully the best of the historians of Italian fascism had been in drawing the radical differences between the anti-Semitism and racism that one might have found in the last years of Mussolini's rule, which is what I was just talking about, and the anti-Semitism and racism of Hitler, every feature of the anti-Semitism and racism of National Socialism was attributed, without argument, to fascism. Anti-Semitism and genocidal racism became defining properties of an ill-conceived, all-inclusive neo-fascism. So let's say that again. Anti-Semitism and genocidal racism became defining properties of an ill-conceived, all-inclusive neo-fascism. Hold on just a second. While specialists in the study of historic fascism had been clear that there were major and unbridgeable differences between Mussolini's regime and that of Adolf Hitler. By the 1990s, the students of Neofascism seemed prepared, for whatever reason, to revert to the wartime identification of the two. So that's my thesis, is that the propaganda campaign, we just slip back into it, and the reasons why are the important part, but this is the first step in understanding what's going on and then trying to figure out why it happened. No matter the apparent sophistication of the discussion, the students of Neofascism in the 1990s were prepared to merge, literally, without remainder, Italian fascism with German National Socialism, thereby making any intimation of anti-Semitism grounds for one's identification as neo-fascist. So this is a really important point. So the wartime slogan fascist gets linked to National Socialism. And then out of all the things that National Socialism did, good and bad, the only one you really need to understand is anti-Semitism. That's the perspective of the Bugman and the Western liberal democratic politician. And you can probably figure out why. So the only thing that matters about what Hitler did is that he killed Jews. It doesn't matter that if you read the mainstream history sources, Hitler's responsible for the death of like 10 million Russians or 2 million Poles or whatever. That doesn't matter. What matters are the deaths of the Jews under Hitler's rule. And since, according to these people, anti-Semitism is the major component. It doesn't matter about any of the infrastructural projects that Hitler did. It doesn't matter if they fixed the economy. It doesn't matter if they fixed the birth rate or the schools or the environment or any of that stuff. None of that matters. The only thing you need to know is anti-Semitism. And so then anti-Semitism and National Socialism are synonymous. And then National Socialism and Fascism are synonymous, so then anti-Semitism means fascism by definition, even though the historical fascists weren't anti-Semitic. Okay, where are we? Any suggestion that the massacre of Jews had not taken place under Nazi auspices during the Second World War was considered sufficient to identify one as neo-fascist. So the historical revisionist community, the Holocaust revisionist community, the people that say that, for instance, the gas chambers in Auschwitz or Treblinka or Belzec or any of those places, there's a bunch of testimonies that say that, like we'll use, I think it's the one at Belzec, but they say that the gas chamber was 25 square meters and they're putting 700 people at a time into the gas chamber, and that's basically the only evidence for it existing is that testimony. So if you think you can get 700 people into 25 square meters, well, that's the situation you're in with that. And then other people say, well, that's not, that doesn't sound reasonable to me, and therefore I don't think it happened. What A. James Gregor is saying, that, well, then that person would be identified as neo-fascist, even though they might themselves be a conservative, or they might be a liberal, or famously Paul Rossinier was one of the first Holocaust deniers, historical revisionists in history. He was a French communist, I want to say, who was in concentration camps because he was caught by the Germans and he was a nonviolent partisan. And so he was put in a concentration camp. And then after the war, when he heard people talking about mass gassings of millions of people, he said, "This is bullshit. I was there and I saw what happened there, and this didn't happen." So Paul Rossinier was a communist, and he, because he denied the Holocaust, said it didn't happen, he would be identified as a neo-fascist. And so what Gregor's pointing out is that the use of this term and its application by the people who are advocating its use are inconsistent with the historical record and with everything that the scholars have come up with about historical fascism in the 20th century. And it's going to get even worse. By the mid-1990s, this is Gregor, by the mid-1990s, the entry criteria for admission into the class of neo-fascists had become increasingly slack. Any opposition to free immigration from anywhere, under any circumstances, afforded immediate entry as a quote-unquote racist into the class of neo-fascists. So now, one of the other big pillars of the post-war liberal order, the New World Order, is not just the anti-Semitism stuff that I just mentioned, but also the racist stuff. So that meant that all of the Western European colonial empires had to be dismantled, and we had to start a great pulling of all of the non-white peoples of the world into Europe, into America, into Australia, into Canada as well. All of the white nations of the world had to be flooded with non-white people. And as we know today, this had been planned for a long time. The reason why it happens is that there is a coalition of big business people who want cheap labor. That's one part of the coalition. The other part of the coalition are the liberal progressive types who want to destroy white countries because they have internalized the belief that whiteness is evil and Hitler and leads to destruction of all that's good and holy. So we have to diversify forcefully all white countries to take away their power to create evil in the world. And then the third coalition are small groups of minorities in Western countries that thrive in situations of multiculturalism and diversity and typically keep themselves highly segregated from that. And therefore, the more fractured the host society is, the more they thrive. So that's the tripartite coalition of why this happened. And then in order to keep that program going, they had to come up with a propaganda method to try to shut people up. And so the words racist and neo-fascist were used in that effort, because no one would want their country to be flooded with people who don't look like them and don't share their values, and so don't speak their language, all that kind of stuff. No one wants that. So naturally there was pushback, and then the governments, NGOs, and academics, and all of the opinion makers labeled those people as racists and neo-fascists. And so A. James Gregor is just seeing this whole thing happen from within his own scholarly field of the study of fascism, but he's really dealing with political forces that are worldwide and coming from the very top of the human pyramid. Little in the way of an explanation can be offered for the intensity with which the search for neo-fascism has proceeded since the middle of the 1990s. There's been constant talk of the quote-unquote rise of neo-fascism throughout Europe, and yet those groups that might be credibly identified as neo-fascists achieved little electoral success. And so this is one of those things, if they talk about the rise of anti-Semitism or the rise of hate or the rise of neo-fascism or whatever, these things are always said to be on the rise, and if they really were on the rise, they would have taken over by now. So it's just lies. It's just propaganda. Those that have been successful, like the Italian Alleanza Nazionale, display, as will be argued, very few features that might objectively be identified as neo-fascist. For all that, those dedicated to the pursuit of neo-fascism have continued with their task, distinct from those who have once again taken up the notion that fascism and neo-fascism can only be understood as tools of industrial capital. The non-Marxists have sought to sustain their efforts by providing a somewhat novel rationale. While eclectic in terms of its substance, picking through those interpretations of fascism considered and largely dismissed by their predecessors, some of the spokespersons for the new orientation have chosen to return to the convictions entertained by those who fought the Second World War. We are told that if we wish to comprehend how so much violence and bloodshed marred the history of the 20th century, we must first appreciate that Hitler's National Socialism and Mussolini's Fascism were essentially one and the same, and that together they were afflicted with a special pathology that, quote, lies behind the hatred and destructiveness, end quote. Fascism, in some real sense or other, was the source of the mass murder, barbarism, and inhumanity that martyred humanity throughout the past century. While there was a recognition that the political violence and brutality of fascist Italy, quote, paled into insignificance, end quote, when compared with that of National Socialist Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union, the term, so, Mussolini, he had his goons beat up a lot of people, beat up a lot of violent communists, beat up a lot of striking workers who were run by communist gangs, beat up a lot of mafia figures. So they did a lot of that. But as far as I know, they weren't going out and executing, dozens of people at a time or thousands of people at a time, which is what was going on in the Soviet Union. And I'd really like to see a study showing how many people were killed in National Socialist Germany up until the war started. It's got to be a small number of people, guys. It really does, and people forget that because of how awful the war was on both sides, like all the really bad stuff that happened during World War II. But I would really like to see that. And if you know something about that, I'd like to see it. I'd like to know how many people were killed by the state in Germany between 1933 and 1939. I'd say it was probably 2,000 or 3,000 and no more than that, which is probably fewer people than the American government has killed over a comparable period. Okay, let's see here. Fascism, in some real sense or another, was the source of the mass murder, barbarism, and inhumanity. I think we read that. Yeah, okay. Paled into insignificance with that of National Socialist Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union. The term, quote-unquote, Neofascism was reserved for the regimes of Hitler and Mussolini, with scant attention devoted to the mass murder regimes of Stalin, Mao, or Pol Pot. We are told that Hitler was narcissistic and megalomaniacal in the effort to explain his homicidal destructiveness, but little along those lines are said of Stalin, or Mao, or Pol Pot, as though genocidal impulses were the affliction of quote-unquote fascists alone. He doesn't have quotes around it, but I would put quotes around that. Only those movements and regimes animated by, quote, a political ideology based on paleogenetic ultranationalism, end quote, were deemed capable of the kind of inhumanity that had fueled the massacre of millions. And so now we know from this basic example that the crime is really not killing millions of people. It's killing them for certain reasons, or it's who you kill. If you kill people for nationalism, you're a bad guy. If you kill Jews, you're a bad guy. If you kill millions of Ukrainians or Chinese to bring about the materialist utopia, then you're a good guy, or you're at least not a bad guy. And if you bomb, if you roast hundreds of thousands of old men, women, and babies alive from planes, which the Allies, the British and the Americans did during World War II, if you roast old men, women, and babies alive from planes by deliberately targeting civilian centers, then you're the good guys, you're the heroes. So that's the ethical system that we all of us occupy. That's the 20th century ethical system. You bomb civilians, you're the good guys. You kill people to bring about the materialist utopia, you're the good guys. You kill Jews, you're the bad guy. You kill anyone for nationalist reasons, you're the bad guy. It seems obvious that if such were the case, then all the Marxist-Leninist regimes of the 20th century must have been regimes predicated on, quote, palingenetic ultranationalism. That's weird, that word spelled palingenetic, and then it's also spelled palingenetic. We'll have to look that up later. Palingenetic ultranationalism, end quote. For none of them were less destructive of human life than was National Socialist Germany. There seems to be very little other than a choice between identifying all Marxist-Leninist political systems as palingenetic ultranationalisms, or that palingenetic ultranationalism is not the sole source of barbarism, inhumanity, and mass murder. This is the trap that I described earlier that he walked these people into. It's too bad that they're not honest, or else they would think this was a problem for their ideas. But they're not honest, so they don't care. The latter seems more plausible, but we are never quite sure where this kind of analysis might lead one. Now that we know that Joseph Stalin was an anti-Semite and a nationalist, let's see the citation on that. See the discussions in Jonathan Brandt and Vladimir P. Naumov. Stalin's last crime, the plot against the Jewish doctors, 48 to 53. 2003 book. And then Gennady Kostrachenko, Out of the Red Shadows, Anti-Semitism in Stalinist Russia. So I don't know if Gregor really believes that, or if he's just kind of poking fun at these people, saying, look at these major books that say that Stalin's an anti-Semite and a nationalist, or if he really believes it. We are left with the suspicion that Soviet Marxism might really have been a variant of Hitler's National Socialism. Sorry about that. The worst was yet to come. The search for Neofascism had entered into crisis. Efforts were undertaken to negotiate the difficulties. Some made recourse to quote-unquote postmodern insights and to attendant hermeneutic strategies apparently invoked to quote-unquote demystify the conceptual confusions that had collected around the subdiscipline. Metaphors, trope, quote-unquote idealized abstractions, and analogies were all pressed into service as quote-unquote heuristic devices, intended to illuminate the undertaking. To study Neofascism effectively, we were counseled to consider it to be something like quote-unquote slime mold, brainless and amorphic, enjoying a capacity to undertake quote-unquote remarkable metamorphoses. Neofascism, previously just difficult to define, was spoken of as possessed of a, quote, protean quality to generate myriad permutation, end quote. Over time, apparently in no particular sequence, Neofascism not only adopts and adapts a, quote, radically changed ideological content, end quote, its ideology and structure are equally subject to, quote, major mutation in the way it can manifest itself outwardly as an anti-systemic political force. This is great, guys. I love this. It can everywhere and at any time assume, quote, new guises, end quote. As a consequence, it can assume postures that distinguish it from both historic fascism and National Socialism, to present us with what can only be an insoluble conundrum. So this is him obliterating these postmodernists, and I did a little bit of research into this, and these guys are really kooky for one. What they are, I think, is some of them are obscurantists. Okay, and what that means is they want to cover their really thin and unoriginal and indefensible idea with a whole bunch of draperies and ornamentation to make it look like something more than it is. So their basic idea here is that fascism is formless and it changes, okay? If fascism is formless and it changes, then it does not exist as such. Then it is nothing, okay? It doesn't exist. Because form and content are the characteristics that we use to identify and define something. So they're just rejecting that outright, And therefore, whatever they don't like is fascism. Okay? Whatever they don't like is whatever they don't like, and there's a bad name, and they call it by that. That's one half of it. The other half of it is that a bunch of these guys, like I think Derrida, Deleuze, a couple other ones, I can't remember off the top of my head because I'm not really big into this subject, but several of those guys that I looked up, they were Jewish, and they're Jewish philosophers, and one of them I think was even from a long line of rabbis. And to me, this looks exactly like Kabbalah, okay? If you look into Kabbalah, if you read about it, it sort of functions as a way for the rabbis to explain whatever they want to explain in an obscurantist fashion with whatever outcome that they want. So they have like a black box, right? So they have something they don't like opposition to immigration, okay? The saying that you want to keep Germany for the Germans, Finland for the Finns, France for the French, etc. Opposition to immigration. Then their postmodernist philosophy is a black box full of a whole bunch of crazy words and turns of phrase that are deliberately obscurantist. And so you feed in the opposition to immigration, it gets jumbled up in a whole bunch of vocabulary, and then what comes out on the other side is it's fascist, or it's Nazi, or it's genocidal, or whatever it happens to be. And if you look at how Kabbalah works, it's basically the same thing. The rabbi, because the Kabbalistic rabbi, because he's got an IQ of 350, and because he's got 100 books on the shelf behind him over here, like this, except he's got like a gigantic wall of, 400 million pages on the wall that he's all memorized. He can see into the inner structure of the universe and, manipulate the same kind of divine forces that make up God. So he's controlling God through strumming the little strings of the multiverse or whatever with his 350 IQ, and then he's going to come up with something that you can't understand. But because you've accepted the premise that he's so high above you in education and ability, you have no choice. So it's like the argument from authority kind of deal, and that's essentially what these postmodernist guys are doing. These postmodern philosophers. You can't understand what they're saying. You just have to accept that they're an authority, and then once you do that, they can manipulate you and walk you in any direction that they want. So, what to say about that? The only way that those guys got credibility was through the media. So the media pumped those guys up, pushed them forward, made them famous, and then they were just probably pushing whatever ideology the political elite wanted in exchange for more press exposure. So their vaunted intellectual capacity is a complete figment, in my opinion. Okay, we'll continue with the text. We are left with the counsel that we can expect Neofascism to appear in any and all forms, without the semblance of ideological continuity with its historical antecedents, in total, unpredictable manifestations. All this really leaves us with little to guide our efforts. Neofascism apparently can assume any guise, any institutional form, or any ideological content. Given all that, it is difficult to imagine what the term quote-unquote neo-fascist might mean. That was my critique, right? There seems, for example, to be little pretense that one might expect to find any particular fascist content in the ideology of the presumptive contemporary neo-fascism. But without any identifiable content, neo-fascism could manifest itself as anything. Thus, for example, fundamentalist Christians, libertarians, and economic conservatives can all be held to be neo-fascists. And if you remember earlier in the paper, in the first or second episode of this series, he actually said this happened in the 1950s. So anyone like Barry Goldwater was said to have fascist tendencies. So this new shit, this postmodernist stuff, is really just a tired old resuscitation of stuff that was already going on 50 and 60 years, 40, 50 years before. can all be held to be neo-fascists, no matter what their beliefs and however much they insist that their doctrines preclude any such association. For the postmodernists' search for neo-fascism, almost anything, including the quote-unquote proletarian racism to be found among punk rock and heavy metal bands, constitutes a, quote, current of fascism. It is as though all the work undertaken by specialists to provide us with some coherent understanding of Italian fascism is of no relevance to the contemporary study of neo-fascism. To accept postmodernist guidance in the pursuit of neo-fascism is to leave us without direction and bereft of any hope of real success. By the beginning of the 21st century, the frenetic search for neo-fascism had fallen on evil times. It was acknowledged by some that, quote, the term fascism fits everything, end quote. Thus, even if we were to, quote, add the cult of Celtic mythology and the mysticism of the Grail, end quote, to some set of beliefs or another, admittedly, quote, completely extraneous to official fascism, end quote, we could still identify that set of beliefs as a neo-fascist variant of neo-fascism. So accommodating do the postmodernist standards of evidence appear to be. One of the apparent consequences of all this is simply to have us acknowledge the existence of an quote-unquote ur-fascism and quote-unquote eternal fascism that will forever be with us, like the burden of original sin. In effect, it appears that the contemporary search for neo-fascism has not been particularly productive of cognitively reliable results. That's an understatement. And why should it be? It's all instrumental and propagandistic. It's not supposed to yield cognitively reliable results. It's just supposed to manipulate the masses and push a certain political program. And it works because people like conservatives don't have any guts, and they allow themselves to be railroaded by this kind of rhetoric. We are left with an incredibly confused picture of the past, implausible strategies for understanding the present, and a hopelessly baffling outlook on the future. It is not clear that the study of neo-fascism, as it has matured over the past half-century, justifies the expenditure in time and treasure that has accompanied it. It is not evident that anything can be done in the near future to change those realities very much. So many of our academics, trained by a committed generation of scholars and their immediate heirs, seem inextricably wedded to a left-right dichotomy that narrows the intellectual vision, blurs comparative perspective, and confounds objective judgment. Perhaps going over the field once again may offer the occasion of reviewing what we do know about paradigmatic fascism in a fashion that might suggest, implicitly or by indirection, something that influences others to refocus attention and recalibrate judgment. And so we've come to the end of this chapter. Perhaps we might do more from this book in the future, but for right now, I would like to thank you sincerely for sticking with me through this. I thought we might do 6, but we ended up doing 5 total. Several hours, 5 hours maybe, 4 or 5 hours. So thank you for sticking with me. Thank you for the comments that you've left and the support. And hopefully I'll talk to you again soon with something else that you'll be interested in. Thank you for your time.